Ladies and gentlemen, this is a Standard Chartered Bank special session featuring Indian Olympic gold medalist Abhinav Bindra, Ronojoy and Joy Bhattacharjya, who will discuss India's quest for gold at the Rio Olympics 2016. And the session is titled Games People Play.
Hello, can you hear us? Yeah. Warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out here. And today, primarily, we are fortunate. It's very difficult to ever have a place where, half the people you announce with just one sentence. But that's it for at least one of my co-speakers on stage. Today, we're going to discuss a question. Fundamentally, we're going to try and answer a question that I've spent about 20 years working in sport. So this question has been asked to me since 1995, which is, why does India not produce more important sportsmen? Why don't we do better at sport despite being a billion people? The only way that question has changed in the past 20 years when I've been asked that question is from being why does a nation of 1 billion people not produce more champions, it's become why does a nation of 1.3 billion not produce more champions. So here we are finally at a place where I have at least a couple of gentlemen who are eminently qualified to talk about it. First, Ronojoy, who is an academic, who is with the National University of Singapore right now, and he's written probably the magisterial book on the history of Indian sport. Ronojoy, good to have you here. Let's have a warm welcome for him. And with him is a man who, as I said, it's very rare that you have a one-line description for a man. India's only individual Olympic gold medalist. Yes, the one and only Abhinav Bindra. And not only does he shoot extremely well, the brief time that I spent with him before we got on stage, I can make out that he retorts equally fast. So the bullets will fly thick and fast today. But also, frankly, I've rarely come to a situation where I have one of the gentlemen on stage who's written a book which involves the other gentleman. So Ronojoy, I'll ask you to start by a quick excerpt that you have which also involves the gentleman on your left, on your right. Ronojoy.
Thanks, Joy, for the very generous introduction, and thanks, Abhinav, for being here. So I'll just read a very small excerpt since we have Abhinav with us. This is a chapter which is titled Life Beyond Cricket and looks at the contemporary situation. So just take 2 or 3 minutes. Two other sports in which India has excelled in recent times can be traced to an earlier era. One is shooting, which is descended from the shikars organized by the Maharajas and the colonial elite, and archery, which of course goes back much further. India's first shooter to excel in international competitions was a former Maharaja, Karni Singh of Bikaner, a princely state known for its hunts during the colonial period. Singh was a 17-time national champion in clay pigeon and skeet shooting, and he also represented India at the Olympics 5 times between 1960 and 1980. Even though Karni Singh did not win an Olympic medal, he participated in the World Shooting Championship and the Asian Games and won India's first shooting medal in 1974. In what is perhaps a unique record, both Karni Singh and his 14-year-old daughter, Rajeshri Kumari, represented India at the Asian Shooting Championship in Tokyo in 1967. The princely flag was kept flying as well by another former Maharaja, Randhir Singh of Patiala, who competed and won medals in international tournaments. As with other sports in independent India, the democratizing tendencies have affected shooting. India's first Olympic medal in shooting was won, again not surprisingly, by an army officer, Rajyavardhan Rathore, in 2004. The army connection was kept alive in the 2012 Olympics when Vijay Kumar won a silver medal. But it was left to a businessman's son from Chandigarh, Abhinav Bindra, to win India's one and only individual Olympic gold medal. The story of how Bindra took up and excelled in shooting is well documented in his autobiography, co-written with journalist Rohit Brijnath. One of the most startling aspects of Bindra's journey to the gold medal was the lack of any kind of state support, which is amply illustrated by the title of a chapter in his book, and I quote, "Mr. Indian Official, Thanks for Nothing." Bindra's was a sports quest mostly funded and supported by his family and the odd private sponsor. It also did not help that shooting is a sport with no big prize money or fans, but only, and I'm quoting him from his autobiography here, paper certificates and tin medals. And the Olympics as a single moment that define shooters. And what Bindra writes, and I quote him here, I envy cricketers standing in the midst of Eden Gardens, surrounded by a collective of 100,000 fans, heaving like one worshipful beast. My name has never been chanted. It will never be, Bindra confessed. The relative obscurity of the sport did not, however, matter when Bindra ended up winning India's first and only one to date individual Olympic gold. It was a testament to the paucity of India's successes in the Olympics that on his return to India, Bindra received more than 350 congratulatory telegrams, something that Indians still used in the internet age until they were discontinued in 2013, and some cities named roads after him. Bindra and Rathore have had a ripple effect. When Bindra took part in his first nationals in the mid-1990s, he had 300 competitors, a number that by 2009 had jumped to around 3,000.
Abhinav, first, wonderful having you here. Just tell me something. When you started shooting in the 90s, did you ever think you'd be the first to win a gold for India?
Honestly, I always aspired to. On some days, I believed. And on some days, I believed, no, it's not going to happen. But there were some days where I believed, yeah, it's a possibility. Yes, and that's how it was. But when I started out, obviously, it was difficult because I didn't really have anybody to look up to. The sport there was no knowledge available in that sport in India, and yeah, it was all trial and error, and all that's changed now, as he wrote in his book. I think my first nationals, 300 participants. The last nationals, I think even more, 4,000. So in a way, it's really good for the sport, but it's harder for me now. So
You're not. So I have one question to you, and that is that as you can make out from his Mr. Indian this thing, thanks for nothing. This is going to be a very politically correct session because obviously Mr. Bindra can be dependent upon to say nothing to absolutely hurt anybody. So my question to you is that have things got better in the last 6, 7, 8 years? Have they actually got better? Are the bureaucracy better? With these Olympic gold quest and tops and whatever else was being tried, have things got better?
I would say they definitely have progressed. I think there's definitely more government funding available to sport. For example, the sport of shooting gets more funding, and rightly so because we won successive Olympic medals. But in all reality, I think the government should really not be involved in the business of sport. It's not their job, and they're trying to do it, but honestly, they can't do it, and they can't really do it well. It's a job where world sport is at such a competitive level world over that you need professionals handling everything, and you need people who know how to run sport, who have enough knowledge about sports performance, taking decisions, and all that obviously needs to change. And I don't believe that. I believe the government is doing whatever they can at the moment, but honestly, they have their limitations. The government has their own ways of functioning. They have audits and they have accounting processes which sometimes take time. And unfortunately, elite athletes do not have the luxury of time. So when you need funding right there and then. There's no use if the funding is going to come a week before the Olympic Games.
Signing 30-odd forms and 20 NOCs. And
so there is a process the government has to follow, but obviously, it's not the ideal situation.
Ronojoy, you've taken a much more global view of it, and you've looked and traced the history. But why he has asked a fundamental issue. He says that government should not really be the people taking the lead. It should be corporates. It should be taking, and corporates finally will come into business when there is interest. That's the truth of it. They're not going to come in if people are not interested. So where in our history do you see that flaw, that fault line that has a situation where it has to be the government who just keeps pumping in money? Where did that happen? How did that happen?
I think right from 1947, when India becomes independent, I don't think sport was really a high priority in the early years of independent India for the Nehruvian state. And this, I would argue, was somewhat in contrast to China, where I think the whole philosophy of someone like Mao, a physical culture, sport was intricately tied to national pride, and this wasn't the case with India. Whether for good or bad, I think that's up for debate. And through the 50s and 60s, I came across documents. For instance, M.C. Chagla, who was the famous Chief Justice from Bombay, and then he was actually briefly we didn't have a sports ministry then. It used to come under the culture ministry. And if you read some of his statements, he made a speech in 1962, I think, where he says that it's far more important to get more children to get them to play, get more playing grounds, more playing fields, and winning wasn't really the sort of be all and end all. So one of the arguments I make is that India does have a culture of sport, perhaps confined to the elites for a long time, but maybe we don't have the culture of winning.
So, and come back to that, we are saying that culture of winning. So it's a question of, you're saying that our focus was rather on health and, well-being rather than on creating champions which, create a national pride. Is that still the case? I mean, look, even now the ministry is not the Ministry of Sports. It's the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports. It's not technically sport. Do you think that the focus is, do you think the government today is taking a larger focus of saying I'm going to have grounds everywhere and a smaller focus of saying I'm going to create champion athletes? Do you think that that needs to change?
Well, there are two aspects to it, and both have to be dealt individually. I think India necessarily does not really have a culture of sport there, and we need to actively work towards getting there. If we really want to win 100 medals at the Olympic Games, we need to have sport as a social activity. When, on a weekend, when parents want to take their kids to do something, they go and play sport. Once that starts to happen, and not necessarily competitive sport, just go out there and play. And that is something which is very, very important to build on. And of course, there's the other aspect of elite performance and what China has done really well. They won their first Olympic gold medal in 1984, and it came in the sport of shooting. And look where they've reached now. It's a nation's effort towards getting there. They spend, I think each gold medal of theirs costs millions and millions of dollars because so much effort goes into it. I mean, I've often been to China and I go to their provincial facilities, and they're like any Olympic stadium anywhere in the world. So the possibilities that they've created are enormous and incredible.
I want to ask one question, and this comes from where you're saying China today, definitely, if you want to see the advancement of sport, but I would like to argue that a similar story could be said about the Soviet state between, post 52 and to where it is now. And a lot of that, frankly, was, pushing kids beyond every, the press sisters. There were lots of allegations, whether it's doping or not. It was almost inhuman pressure on a lot of children. Do you think China is doing the same? And do you think we necessarily need to look at that as an option? Or there's a mid-path, as Abhinav would have probably say?
Right, if you look at the numbers, there is little doubt. I think someone had calculated that in the 2012 Olympics, every 15.5 million or 16 million Chinese produced a medal, whereas for India the comparable number was something like 205 million. So it's a huge gap. But you're right. What might loosely be called the Soviet model, where kids are picked up at a very young age, pressured immensely, and of course we also know the sordid sort of saga of steroids, drugs, which was also a factor in the. Maybe now there are a much more sort of controls on the international side, but that the Chinese model, I think, also follows some aspects of the Soviet model, and that is something. I personally don't think that is not only should we follow, and neither is it workable. I think in a system, a democracy like India.
Yeah, also, you come to the same thing. We were looking at World Cup and Indian performances for the Football World Cup. And the argument always thrown up is that, India has, we need enough grounds and nutrition and this thing because that's how it's done in Europe and all. But the truth of it is, Europe has won 11 Football World Cups. South America has won 9, and their facilities are more chaotic than us. If you tell me that, Ronaldinho's nutrition is any better than that of Bhattacharjya or any of the players playing today, that's not true. So finally, also there's this little matter of passion and that game really catching this thing. So I want to ask you one question, Abhinav. When we are coming to this, are we better at individual sports? As an Indian, as a psyche, as a nation, are we better at individual sport? Do we tend to produce, because the champions have come mainly other than hockey, despite, in individual sports rather than in team sports? Because, cricket is a difficult one to say because, about 11 nations play it seriously. But in any other country that you have a look, you'll see that, we've done better at individual sports other than hockey.
Well, I think we're good at skill sports, sports that require fine motor control, fine hand-eye coordination. I think we're more naturally gifted towards those sports. Having said that, we won a few medals in wrestling, and that does not require too much fine motor control. But skill. I think when hockey was played on grass, there was more skill to it. Now it's much more physical. So I think sports which require more skill, I think we may be more gifted towards those.
Ronojoy?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely nations which are as poor or have as malnutrition children as India or even worse. But I think some of those countries are one sport nations in the sense, of course, these are sports that are there in the Olympics. So countries like Kenya, great at long distance running and generally in athletics, but not really very good in other sports. And again, that applies to countries like Ethiopia. Brazil, I think, is an interesting example where, comparable to India in certain ways, but although I think their social indicators still, ahead of India on several counts, where they were, of course, a footballing nation, but increasingly they've been very good at other sports, other athletics. So maybe that's the kind of model India needs to look to. But I don't think besides hockey, and leave aside cricket, India doesn't really, there's no other sport that Indians have had a sort of historical affinity to, except perhaps wrestling, and that is something that I focus on. In wrestling, you can sort of trace it back, back to the Mahabharata actually, and it's kind of ironical that after this sort of great 18-day war, the outcome of the Mahabharata is then Yudhishthira decides that it's going to be a battle between Duryodhana and Bhim, and it's incredible that the outcome is wagered on that one single wrestling match. So yeah, wrestling I think goes back, and we also have texts in medieval India, which deal with wrestling techniques, the wrestling regimen. We have accounts from the Vijayanagara kingdom. So wrestling is a sport, I think, maybe because we have an unbroken history of sorts. And then of course there were people like Gama and our very own Gobor Guho from North Calcutta. So I think wrestling is a sport we are seeing a renaissance, maybe partly because we do have a history. An ethos of wrestling.
It's one interesting question you ask here. We have a professional wrestling league and we do that. Do you think that a large part of also the spread of wrestling is that it's part of our ethos, but it's also the fact that we are winning medals? I mean, success breeds success. Like, wouldn't you say that this shooting, the start off was the fact that you are getting medals? Is that what's bringing more people into the game?
Yes,
really, if you see Anand, hockey, chess since 87 has changed because of Vishwanath Anand. We have some 30-odd grandmasters today. And, would you say that your success has really spurred on more shooting, brought more people into shooting?
It's hard to say that, but end of the day, nothing succeeds like success. And I think it breaks it helps in the mindset, it helps in the attitude. When you have when young people get into the sport, they have somebody to follow, they want to become like somebody, and they know that it's possible to become a world beater. I think those aspects really help.
Coming back to you as this thing, when did you decide, and for the benefit of the larger audience, when did you decide that you wanted to become a professional shooter? And at what point did you say that, I'm going to do this alone, with support, without support, I'm going to do it?
I'm still in the thinking process.
After one gold medal, you can think for the rest of your life and nobody left.
I really am. Honestly, I still keep thinking about it.
But how did you get into shooting?
Yeah, good question. I was a really fat boy, and my
liar.
No, I was a really fat boy, and I went to boarding school, and I hated boarding school.
I have heard horror stories. You were at Doon, right?
Yes, and I hated that school, and and the one
politically correct. I always told you, you're going to hear some very politically correct statements today.
But the one thing, I used to receive a letter from my father almost every day, and the one thing that was common in it was play sport. I, of course, didn't play any sport while I was there. So I left the Doon school, and the constant thing I heard at home then was play some sport. So then somebody introduced me to a shooting coach, and I went and went and tried it, and I really liked it because I didn't need to move. So that's why.
You're rarely going to hear stuff like this coming on the stage. Well done. Yeah, keep going.
That's how I took it up. But nevertheless, I do a lot of physical activity now. I run 10 kilometers 5 times a week now. So things have changed.
Things have changed. How they've changed, yeah? Yeah, so, no, look, seriously, you are a poster boy for Indian sport. And you tell me that you started off just because it's a one activity that you could do because, nobody else would bother you because at least you were playing some sport? That's the only reason you started?
I liked it. I obviously liked the process of shooting. Shooting is a very addictive type of an activity. It's probably it's the most private sport played in public, and it's so individual. And the success on each shot is totally dependent on you, and that really fascinated me.
Okay, one thing I want to ask on this is, it's very interesting. I remember seeing you after you won. Okay. And on television when they showed your reactions and all, and it was very because it was very muted. Normally you have cricketers and all throwing things and jumping up, and our sense was that in shooting your concentration gets so deep that for you to even come out and come to a level of reaction is very difficult. Is that the case? I mean, once you're shooting, you're so much in the zone that for you to sort of come back to normal and...
That's a bit of fantasy, but...
Politically correct. Thank you. Look, I normally don't fantasize about shooters, but in your case, I'm willing to make an exception.
No, I think competing at the Olympic Games is a very draining experience. I think in order for me to win personally, it may not be draining for another person, but for me to do well or to win any medal, leave alone the Olympics, it requires me to give my everything and mobilize each resource that I have with me, because I'm not really talented. So I needed to do that. So yeah, I was really exhausted. I was done.
Okay, you were just exhausted.
I needed 2 years to recover.
Jeez, wow. So Ronojoy, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to come to from Mahabharata times. I just want to move to a place where really modern sport as it's played. Leave wrestling aside, maybe wrestling, kabaddi, and kho aside. It's really the rest of them have British origins, and so it really started with the British. So two things. One is that, do you think on the whole the British were a positive influence in Indian sport and not? And secondly, I'd like you to pick up a story of where the renaissance of the Indian movement in Indian sport started, excerpt from your book after that, please.
Yeah, I think before the British came, sport was pretty much, I think, confined to the elites. And like in any other sphere, the economy, society, anything, I think the British really, the entry of the British revolutionized sport too. And I think there's this famous essay, they taught the world to play. And I think it's not just India. I think the British Empire, the far-flung colonies, introduced all the sports that we sort of, look at as mass sports. Be it, football, be it cricket, be it hockey. Everything is really, coming from the British. So in that sense,
it's not a bad statement to make sitting in Victoria Memorial. Go on, please.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, so I think in that sense, the games that we play today are very much, excepting for say kabaddi and wrestling maybe, are very much the sports that the British bring in. So in that sense, I think they were the sort of effect in terms of
super.
Sport.
On that note, I'd like you to read, and he's written this really wonderful excerpt, we'll excerpt from his book, which is about 1911 and Mohun Bagan, the East Yorkshire Regiment. The rest I leave to you, Ronojoy. All yours.
I guess many of you are familiar with the Mohun Bagan victory. In fact, I was in Jaipur a couple of days ago, and I did mention 1911, and the moderator asked the crowd, which was a fairly large crowd, how many had heard of Mohun Bagan in 1911, and there were actually precisely 4 hands. So, so that's, in Bengal we might be familiar with it, but it seems like in the rest of India we are not. So, so I'll just read a few paragraphs about the final game. Again, apologies to those who might be very familiar with the story. So this part is entitled The Famous Victory. The stage was now set for the biggest game yet in Indian football. Mohun Bagan versus the East Yorkshire Regiment of Faizabad in the IFA Shield final on July 29, 1911. In the lead up to the final, emotions had reached fever pitch in India, in Calcutta and its surrounding areas. Tickets for the match, originally priced at rupees 1 and 2, were selling for as much as rupees 15, a small fortune in those days. Such was the enthusiasm that people came from outlying Bengal districts as well as from neighboring Bihar and Assam. On the day of the match, the transport system was completely choked with spectators trying to get to the Calcutta Football Club field in the Maidan. The East Indian Railway ran a special train, and additional steamer services were introduced to ferry spectators to Calcutta from the rural areas. At the field itself, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people gathered. Because most of them could not enter the field, they were kept informed about the proceedings by an ingenious method. As the Reuters correspondent reported, volunteers kept the crowd informed of the progress of the match by flying a kite with the club colors when one of the teams scored a goal. The Empire, a local paper, had also installed a temporary telephone connection to the field to relay instantly the game's progress. The weather gods were kind to Mohun Bagan. Even though the monsoon had arrived, this was July, there was no rain on the day of the final, ensuring that the football pitch was dry and more suitable to playing barefoot. The 50-minute match with a 5-minute break at halftime was thrilling. Both teams were scoreless at halftime. Then with 15 minutes left, the East Yorkshire captain Sergeant Jackson put his team ahead. But within minutes, Bagan's captain, Shivdas Bahaduri, scored as well, triggering an explosion of maroon and green, Mohun Bagan's colours, kites in the sky. With less than 10 minutes before the final whistle, both teams pressed hard for the winning goal. It was centre forward Obhilash Ghosh who caught an immaculate pass from Shivdas to put his team 2-1, ahead 2-1, the final score. History had been made. Mohun Bagan had become the first Indian team to win the coveted IFA Shield. The football correspondent of the Amritabajar Putrika, the largest circulating English daily in Calcutta, then reported, and I quote from the Putrika, "The scene that followed was beyond description. Hats, handkerchiefs, umbrellas, and sticks were waved with the tremendous cheering shook heaven and earth. It was as if the whole population had gone mad, and to compare it with anything would be to minimize the effect." Close quote. The reverberations from Mohun Bagan's victory were felt way beyond the Maidan. The IFA Shield final naturally was widely covered in the local press, but was also cited in the international press. Reuters, the London Times, Daily Mail, and Manchester Guardian all sent reports to London. Newspapers from outside Bengal, like the Times of India from Bombay and the Pioneer from Allahabad, reported extensively on the victory. But it wasn't just Mohun Bagan's performance on the field that excited people. The local media, primarily the English and Bengali newspapers, read two things into the historic triumph. First, clear evidence that Bengalis did not lack physical prowess, and second, the nationalist implications of the victory. In an article entitled The Immortal 11, the Amritabajar Putrika wrote that Bengalis had proved themselves in the sphere of physical culture in which they were so long held to be lamentably deficient. We should point out, I'll just skip this part, another newspaper, the Bengali, was more explicit, proclaiming that the Bengali, and I quote the Bengali newspaper, is no longer the timid and weak-kneed representative of the race whom Macaulay, that is Thomas Babington Macaulay, so foully libelled, close quote. The Bengali newspapers were even more excited about the humbling of the British by Bengali team. The Boshumati wrote that Mohun Bagan, and I quote, had infused a new life into the lifeless and cheerless Bengali, while the Nayok, another newspaper, gushed that the match filled, and I quote, every Indian with joy and pride to know that the rice-eating, malaria-ridden, barefooted Bengalis have got the better of beef-eating, Herculean-booted John Bull in the peculiarly English sport, close quote. Other newspapers played up the nationalist element of the victory. The Englishman commented that Mohun Bagan, and I quote, had succeeded in what the Congress and the Swadeshiwalas have failed to so far, to explode the myth that the British are unbeatable in any sphere of life. And the Boshumati noted that Mohun Bagan, had been able to knit together people in a way that the political parties had not been able to do, close quote.
Amazing. Great excerpt. Nation Play. It's a book on the history of sport in India by Ronojoy. Please do read it if you have a chance. So I am fortunate enough to be in a position to raise another topic which about a year back I probably would be more difficult to do. So I'll start with a story with my days at the Kolkata Knight Riders. So I spent 7 extremely successful and happy years with the Kolkata Knight Riders. So in my first year there, I thought my job, other than to look after the team, was to bring in a certain moral backbone to the team. and talking to them about the gifts they got and everything they got. So I had this group of young players in front of me, and I sat and told them that, they should be absolutely ashamed of themselves. Everything they got for free. I said, यार तुझे ये फ्री मिलता है, वो फ्री मिलता है, कपड़े फ्री मिलते हैं, सब कुछ फ्री मिलता है, लैपटॉप फ्री मिलता है, अरे अंडरवेयर और टूथपेस्ट छोड़कर तो तू कुछ खरीदता ही नहीं है. So I was really angry. And then there was pin drop silence in the room, and then Ishant spoke up and I said, yeah. He said, Joyda, underwear bhi Reebok free mein deta hai. So I want you to ask you that, we have, in Indian sport, if you deal with Indian sport, about 89 to 90% of the actual revenue of Indian sport comes into cricket. Cricket is a 600-pound gorilla in the room. It's a Google of Indian search sport in terms of, what we have. Is that good for Indian sport or not? Ronojoy, you first.
There's always been the sentiment, and if you sort of look at, I was sculling through the letters to the editors in a lot of newspapers, there's sort of hatred towards cricket for the lack of success of the other sports. I think that's somewhat unfair. Cricket has its own history. Whether India's done, India didn't do well for long periods, but they've been doing relatively well since the 80s, 90s. So I don't think you can blame cricket for the lack of other sports, but it's a fact that because of the success of cricket, more youngsters are attracted to playing cricket. There's more corporate sponsorship, and what Abhinav was referring to, the lack of success in the other sports, I think, have unfortunately meant that they've been deprived of funds.
Abhinav?
Yes, I think that's the way it is. I mean, cricket gets all the money, and that's fine. But I think, having said that, I think a lot of resources, a lot of corporate resources, especially now with the CSR rules coming in, hopefully other sports would also get a little bit of money, because it's all right to be successful and get sponsorship then, but for us to grow, for other sports to grow, they also need money at the grassroots level. They need money when they are not successful, and they need resources to build. They need resources to train young athletes. They need resources to train their own coaches. And all that has to happen, and all that requires money. And hopefully that things change now, and things are slow to change, but I'm an athlete, and I'm conditioned to hope. So I remain hopeful.
A good one. That's a good reason to hope. No, I want to ask you, because see, one of the things is that, you can always blame it and say that, cricket is there, cricket's taking all the resources. But let me just, I'll give you an example. In 1972, it was Mrs. Gandhi was riding at the peak because we've just won the Bangladesh war. At that time, Kishore Kumar was seeing at his best. Rajesh Khanna was the superstar of India. And a certain young man called Mr. Vijay Kumar Malhotra became the head of the Indian Archery Association. And 43 years later, forget Indira Gandhi, it's Rahul Gandhi, the grandson, who's now going to trying for power. Google has come, the world has changed, the internet arrived, the Cold War is broken down. The Berlin Wall has gone down. And guess who is the president of the Indian Archery Association? Vijay Kumar Malhotra. 43 years on. There isn't even the Hollywood heroes who normally, star with 3 generations of actresses, daughter, mother, and this thing. Even they don't have the, people that our Indian sort of sports administrators have. So have our administrators done our sport a favor? I'll come to Abhinav later on this, because I know he has very little to say about it. He's all admiration for them. So Ronojoy, you first.
Yeah, I'm sure Abhinav will have much more to say on the administrators, but I think the poor administration had always been a source of frustration for sports enthusiasts, sports journalists. So even going back to the 40s, 50s, you have someone like Talyar Khan, the great commentator and writer, writing columns about the awful administrators, and even someone like Jaipal Singh, who led the our first hockey team to its first Olympic goal in 1928. Jaipal Singh, in the 1930s, I came across pieces by him, again, very critical of the Indian administration. So it's a malaise that goes back a long way. But again, it's...
Why specifically our country? It seems to be more true of our country than anywhere else.
No, in fact, I was coming to that. I don't think India is unique in that. If you sort of look at the situation with FIFA, and even...
that's an interesting topic.
I think administrators, haven't really been that much better elsewhere. But I think what's unique in India, to a certain extent, is the way you mentioned Mr. Malhotra. BJP leader. But India is unique in the way politicians have captured sporting federations, sporting bodies. In a way, I don't think that hasn't happened in any other country. And whether that's a good or bad thing, there are some people like Shekhar Gupta, the former Indian editor, who thinks that the idea that politicians being into administration is not such a bad thing, because he feels that they have the skills to sort of maneuver. They have the skills to get the money. Which automatically, there is the feeling that if former sportspersons are at the helm of sports bodies, that automatically that's going to be better run. That might be a fallacy. I don't think it's an either or. I think what we need are better administrators. It's not that politicians can't do it, but it's also not the fact that if you're a sportsperson, automatically you'll be very good at the job of administering.
Abhinav, I know you've been a huge supporter of Indian administrators, but if there's anything wrong with them, if you just tell us. Slightly, I know you always have praise for them.
No, I think, if the politicians want to stay, I have no problem with it. They can stay. I think I have a funny one to say. I think I was working on the sports bill, and I think Boria was on the drafting of the sports bill committee as well, and we were working on an age limit, and I think we were discussing 70 years. And I think a suggestion came in from one of the politicians that the age limit should be 95 or something like that. So
95, wow, you've eliminated about 0.01% of India's population. Fantastic, amazing.
Yeah, but if they want to stay, I have no problem with it. But I think what is really, really important is that the structure of the organizations, the different sports federations have to be professionalized. You can have the politician as the president, but you need to have a paid CEO looking after the day-to-day functioning of the federation, professionalizing the day-to-day running of the federation. You have to have technical people who take care of the technical aspects of the sport, and only then will things start to get better. But here the case is that only very few federations have a paid CEO, and I think the government even a couple of years ago told all the national federations that we'll give you the money to hire a CEO, but most federations did not want to hire a CEO, because they want to keep all the power with themselves. I don't know if that. I think that keeps the boat afloat. I don't know what it is, but
there's an interesting theory there, and that if my sport becomes more popular and more well-known, means more people will come into it, which means that it will be more difficult for me to get voted back. Because if it's small, then I can get my little coterie to keep voting. And apparently this is very common among federations, because if you grow beyond a certain size, and say people like Arnab start noticing you on national television, then unfortunately you will become accountable. So the smaller you get, the less successful you are sort of kept away in the shade. Does it work for Indian? Does it do Indian sports boards do things like that? That's what I'm asking.
It's possible. That's a theory.
That's a theory. Ronojoy.
Yeah, I don't think I have a very good answer to that. Yeah, but just to go back to the the question of the reforms and the age limits. Of course, we are seeing a little bit of that with the reforms that have been set rolling because of the Supreme Court in cricket and the Justice Mugdal Committee, and so these age limits, etc., are coming into place. It was a stillborn idea when in the earlier UPA government, when Ajay Makkan, when he was a sports minister, the sports bill, what you were talking about, that didn't pass muster, because a lot of the politicians, 95 is a ridiculous thing to argue, but a lot of them felt that if you don't have an age limit for, say, for being an elected representative, can you have an age limit for being part of the sporting body? So I think there was something to that argument, but yeah, you can't sort of capture the term limits. I think are perfectly acceptable.
Abhinav, 2008, for good or for bad, the IPL came in, and there was a certain professionalization of Indian sport in the way at least the event was run, in terms of professional CEOs like Sundar Raman coming in, the first of a breed. The question to you is that after that, there have been a variety of other leagues that have started off, and in fact, Gagan, he must have been talking with you for a long time for an Indian shooting league and the likes. Is this the next sort of wave of Indian? So you've had the British person, then you've had the Maharajas, then you've had the bureaucrats, and now you have the politicians. Is this now the fifth wave? Is it now the time for the professional? Do you think it is coming? Are there more of them in Indian sport right now than you saw maybe 10 years back? More professional managers?
Few here and there. But I think with all the leagues coming in, I think it's good for the sport. It's good for the sports which have these leagues coming in. But a part of me is still skeptical about all these leagues, being very honest. I think I really want to see how they are in 10 years' time. I think they have to have a program where they focus on the grassroots. And most of these leagues are not focused towards the grassroots. And to have the leagues sustainable for a period of time, I don't know if that's going to happen. So we'll have to wait and watch. But on the whole, I think it's good. It's good. It's good for the sports because it's brought in a culture of professionalism. The leagues are professionally run. The organizational aspects are much better than they were previously, and all that filters down into day-to-day functioning as well. So all in all, I think it is a positive thing.
Ronojoy?
Yeah, I think it's a positive thing too. And, say for instance, the Kabaddi League, the Pro Kabaddi League, that's something that has taken off in a way I think no one would have expected it to. And I think some of the numbers that were being bandied about, some of these numbers we could be skeptical about.
Yeah, if you put, if you put stuff on Star Gold, you and me talking on Star Gold would rate one, so that's also an issue.
But I think the number that came up with was something like 435 for 60 million viewers for the inaugural Pro Kabaddi League, which was,
no, seriously,
great.
Good numbers to look
but
at.
But even if it's half that, if you sort of are very skeptical, these are good numbers. So you're sort of reviving a sport, adding bells and whistles and, changing the rules to sort of, suit the
also,
television
market
format.
dynamics. You think that they're looking more at market dynamics. They're really looking now at the eventual spectator much more than they used to.
Right. So it can't be a bad thing, yeah.
Super. So I'd just like to end with you. So I know that about 3 to 4 months later, we'll all be cheering for you at Rio. So just a little bit, how are you preparing, and how do you look at the Olympic Games? And God knows you've seen enough of them.
I'm at the Lit Fest preparing.
This is intellectual. You always said that shooting was a mind sport, so maybe
do you read a lot?
Well, yes, I am preparing well for the games. I'm in a good space at the moment. And then we'll see how it goes. I really don't know how it's going to pan out, but I'm putting my best foot forward. I'm looking forward to the games, and hopefully I'll be successful.
Fabulous. All the best to Abhinav. Ronojoy, thanks for being here, and that's a wonderful book. If you haven't picked up a copy yet, please do. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you so much. Questions from the audience. Wait, lots of them. How can I deny the pleasure of hearing? Boria, would you like to start?
Thanks. Great session. One quick one each. Quick answers. Joy, you mentioned archery. That association almost doesn't exist. The subject was quest for gold. Archery defunct. Boxing defunct. Wrestling half defunct. Hockey problematic. These are the 4 major sports where you aspire for medals. What happens to athletes? Take the Mary Kom, take the Sarita, take the Vikas, take these people. 6 months before Rio, no association. What does an athlete do?
Cry.
That's long answer.
The other one, you said cricket. Interestingly, actually, the BCCI is struggling to get sponsors. Cycle Agarbatti and Paytm were the 2 sponsors for the last. Paytm only sponsor for the domestic series, and Cycle Agarbatti for the last. Do you think the scenario is actually changing? I mean, it is actually sort of going towards other sports a little bit compared to where it was, compared to, say, 2011, 2012.
It could be. Of course, we already see that test matches don't get the kind of not just the crowds. I don't think, as you're saying, they're not getting the the kind of sponsors they need. IPL, I think you probably in a better position to the numbers have been declining. So I think this does open up a space for other sports where I think the professional leagues that are coming up, not just kabaddi, badminton, wrestling. I think there probably is a space in terms both of sponsorship as well as getting an audience. So it's encouraging in that sense.
Abhijit?
Abhinav, when that moment when you were about to shoot and which resulted in the gold, obviously it must have been a very, it was a critical moment. There was immense pressure. How do you seal yourself from all of that and just focus only on that? It's the closest modern equivalent of Arjun looking only at the eye of the target.
I was not any of that. I was just trying to get out of it and not pee in my pants, That was what I was looking at.
He's easily the most distinct. Just sorry, we need one question from the back before we come back here. There's a gentleman out there in a blue jacket, denim jacket. Is that yeah? Are you in a jacket? Yeah, gentleman. Yeah, please go. Sorry, we need to get a mic to him. They're all sportsmen out here, so you might as well chuck it and see how good they do. Okay, so this is going to be the second last question of the evening, then we'll figure out the last question. There are lots here. The gentleman out here I saw in brown would be our last year. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, when we talk about sports in India, we generally think about the mainland India. We commoners have the tendency of skipping over that far eastern part of India. So, what do you think is the future of the sports people from far eastern region like Manipur, Assam, etc., as compared to the sports person of mainland India?
Yeah, I'll if I can take that. Firstly, frankly, as if you look at football today, football is dominated by the Northeast. The Indian football team is dominated by the Northeast. The under-17 kids who are training for the 2017 World Cup, of the 30-odd children who are 30-odd kids who are in the first camp, 10 of them are from Manipur alone, and 17 from the Northeast. In terms of other sports, cycling, there are a lot of sports in which they're doing very well. So, I would, in fact, in a couple of years, we'll say, is the rest of India going to catch up with the Northeast because they're doing really well for themselves? Sorry, gentleman out here first, then I'll come to you. Yeah, please, yeah. If you just pass him the mic, please. Yeah.
Like the developed countries, their per capita income is very high. So people go in line whatever interest they have. But in India, it's the mainstream thought that, bread and butter. So when any child excels in a particular sport, say billiards or chess, then and gives more time into it, the parents start thinking, no, forget this, get into your studies because you have to think about your bread and butter. So maybe when India also gets developed and quality education comes over here, things are going to change. So is this one of the reasons why we don't excel so much in sports?
I'll give that to Ronojoy.
No, I think they've been, economists have sort of looked at this problem and they've come up with this idea that India doesn't have the effective sort of the participating pool of the population that are involved in sports is very low, compared to other countries. And this goes back to what we were talking about, less developed countries, the population does have less access to sports. So I think that is a problem. But I think as in India's GDP grows, India becomes more affluent, I think there will be more of an effective, pool that we can draw on. But the cultural stereotype that we were talking about, parents not wanting their kids, that's a thing that's far more difficult to change.
Last question, yours. Okay.
While Mr. Bindra was sharing his story about how he came to the sports and all the stuff, almost in a whispering tone, he said, I knew and I still know that I am not talented. Most of the champions we have seen, be it Rahul Dravid and most of the names, right? They have said that I am not talented in spite of immense success. So my question to Mr. Bindra is that after so much of success, how do you think or how do you keep on thinking that you are still not talented? Because I think that's the essence of the success also.
I'm not talented in the conventional way. I'm not competitive. I'm not athletic. But I have a talent, and my talent is to work hard. So I believe working hard is a talent, and that is my talent.
I think that's an excellent place to end this session with. Thank you so much, Abhinav. Thank you so much, Ronojoy. It's been wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. So I'll give it to Ronojoy if you can get Abhinav to unveil it so that you can have it. Nationwide Play, A History of Sport in India by Ronojoy Sen, and very, very well worth reading. Buy your copy today.
Thank you.